I just got back from the New York courtroom where Terra founder Do Kwon was sentenced to 15 years. That is higher than the 12 years that prosecutors had argued for in their pre-sentencing memo. We're going to recap everything that we heard, including why Judge Engelmayer, in his decision, opted to hand Do a 15-year sentence in which he explained, quote, this was a fraud on an epic generational scale, and said that even the 12-year sentence would be unreasonably lenient. Of course, as I had covered on Twitter a few hours before that final sentence was handed down, it sounded like that's where Judge Engelmayer was leaning anyways. At about the time, Polymarket only had about a 20% chance-ish of a 12-plus year sentence coming in above where prosecutors were in that plea agreement. Also of note, Judge Engelmayer referenced that infamous Steady Lads tweet deploying more capital from Do Kwon around the time of the DPEG back in 2022, no fewer than 4 times. So a reminder that anything that you tweet as a crypto founder can and will be used against you in the court of law. But want to recap from the very beginning everything that we heard both from prosecutors and Do Kwon's defense team as they arrived at what I think is fair to say, a fairly surprising decision to land at 15 years when it sounded like we were looking for between 5 and 12, 5 being what Do's defense team was asking Judge Engelmayer for to land on, and 12 being what was essentially the backbone of the plea agreement. And a lot went into this decision. This was the longest crypto sentencing that I have covered in my more than 4 years doing crypto-specific crimes in court now. Far longer than SBF's, far longer than Alex Mashinsky's. This one required basically all day in court to eventually land at the 15 years Do got. So let's start from the very beginning. So Do Kwon was shuffled into the courtroom around 11 a.m. as this one was supposed to start, wearing a yellow jumpsuit per usual, and somewhat unusually, this time there were a number of supporters in the courtroom from the Terra community there to witness this in person. And as he came into the courtroom, applause broke out, which obviously did not happen during the SBF sentencing, nor did it happen during the Celsius founder Alex Mashinsky's sentencing. But here, there was applause as Do walked in and sat down at his table, and Do Kwon's attorney, David Patton, who also represented Roman Storm in the Tornado Cash, David Patton said, "Please don't react during the proceedings," after saying, first of all, thank you to everyone for coming out to Do's supporters. So it was pretty interesting that half the courtroom essentially was Terra ecosystem supporters or former employees also there as well in support for Do Kwon. Immediately, though, it seemed as if it was going to be a lengthy day because Judge Engelmayer came in not too soon after that applause and basically went off on the prosecutors, the government in this case, and asked a lot of questions. Essentially took an hour before we got into the meat of the sentencing, asking why he had to stay up past midnight over a number of nights this week reading a flurry of victim letters that only came in last minute. Part of the reason why was because the bankruptcy estate, the Terra bankruptcy estate, had contacted people who had filed hopes to recoup some of their losses. They were contacted and told that this sentencing was happening, and if they wanted to provide victim impact statements, that they should. Judge Engelmayer was wondering if that was ample time, though, because that notice only really went out on Monday, and he noted that there were 315 letters to read through, some of which came in even that morning at 10:33, so about 30 minutes before we were supposed to start, basically slammed the government for handling it that way, which was kind of interesting because obviously the government had posted on their website that this sentencing was happening all the way back in August. So their explanation and excuse was that maybe none of these letters would have even come if the government didn't take up the bankruptcy estate on their offer to contact people, the roughly 16,500 people who are going through that process. And the back and forth was really Judge Engelmayer, I think, setting the record straight as to that happening and asking both sides whether or not they wanted to proceed. Somewhat extremely unusual for the judge in this case to ask the defense and the defendant point blank if they wanted to reschedule the sentencing after we had already gotten kicked off in the courtroom. Essentially, he was worried that Do and his defense team didn't have enough time to read those victim letters, and he made mention that he read each and every one of them and canceled plans that he had to make sure he could read each and every one of them. And again, also stayed up past midnight for multiple nights. Basically said that the government has to do better with this process. But first of all, asked the government, do they want to proceed? They said yes. And then also asked the defense if they wanted to proceed, which to me, I thought they were going to say no, because he again reiterated that, look, if we proceed, you cannot basically make this an excuse after you get the sentencing. I gave you a chance here. And of course, obviously that's to protect on appeals or any other issues that might be brought. Of course, Do has already waived his right to a trial by taking a plea deal and pleading guilty. But nonetheless, Judge Engelmayer, I think, being very careful with this one to pose the question to both sides. Basically, the defense said, yes, I think this court, this case has gotten a lot of attention, so we can move on. And so it took about an hour, but that to me stuck out as a pretty important piece. And it was also when we first heard from Do Kwon, because Judge Engelmayer asked him point blank and said, are you sure that you want to proceed here? And Do said that his lawyers had read the substance of these letters by phone, spent a few hours reading most of the more, quote, more emotional letters, and were read to him. And so he said, yes, let's keep moving along. And Judge Engelmayer basically stressed that because so many in the press, including myself, have been talking about this case, that it shouldn't have come up as a surprise that this sentencing was happening, and likelier than not that anyone who wanted to be heard had enough time. And also made mention that if there are letters that come out after the sentencing, that is after today, that there would still be efforts to include those letters in the docket so victims could be heard who might not have known that this was happening. So at that point, around 12-ish, we got into the actual sentencing as the process normally would have gone, but lost about an hour of time there. And the process was the government opened first, referencing the various victims in the Terra collapse and those who were defrauded. Again, perhaps important to stress here that this was a sentencing similar to Alex Mashinsky, where Do Kwon had already pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges, built mostly around a lot of misrepresentations to investors, whether it was the case that Terra using stablecoins or Chai's transactions on Terra were in fact not the case, as well as misrepresenting the repeg that happened in 2021 due to Jump Crypto's intervention. All of that very much squarely brought up as Do accepted responsibility in what he read. But first up was the government, who walked through all of the victims that they had, which were not that many in person. Only one person read at the podium to talk about their losses, and about 4 were heard by the phone, including one via a Russian interpreter, which I thought was interesting because essentially not the strongest showing from victims who wanted to speak. We heard much more, I think, moving testimonials in the SBF case, although, to be fair, some of those also fell into the camp of talking more about, I guess, I don't want to say revenge, but personal experiences that fell outside of what you might expect from victim statements. And in this case, one of those might have fallen into that case. And the other ones, I thought the one that they chose for the gentleman who spoke in person was well done, because that one was one of the more moving. The victim that spoke in person was Chauncey St. John, who described himself as the founder of Angel Protocol and Better Giving, a charitable donations project that was built on Terra, and describing losses of Walk Church and other various charitable enterprises or religious institutions, things of that nature. Losses in the order of $1 million to $100,000. The victim impact statements here were pretty powerful, including this one where he talks about not only losing his own savings of over $1 million, but also the impact to his wife's family, in-laws now having to work into old age, and read this right as Do is looking on about the relationship that he had with Do, saying that he also asked Do in the collapse what he should do with the funds attached to his own project, and the Do said to get out what he could right before the DPEG, and talked about those losses, but then also closed with that he was praying for mercy and for Do Kwon's soul, which was, again, a pretty powerful victim impact statement. And we heard from other victims, including one that was translated, and even though it was on the phone, it was also another powerful story from the victim. This one, a woman who was 58 years old, I believe, who was living in Georgia and homeless. Again, if you're sitting in the courtroom and someone's not even there, you might not think that it's going to be that powerful of something, but clearly had an impact on Judge Engelmayer as he listened on through the Russian translator as Tatiana, I believe her name was, described the experience of losing $81,000 after selling an apartment to put her money into Terra that eventually turned into $13, and that she thought that people at Terra had taken rational measures instead of what ensued. And it was pretty interesting to think about that being read, because as it was being translated bit by bit, there were still some very powerful bits that came out through that. A very moving story of someone who then described her situation as homeless in the main capital in Georgia, and in a state of deep depression. Now she has no resources to finance her existence. The court was pretty silent for this whole piece, and clearly, I think, communicated some of the losses and what they meant to individual holders of both UST and Luna. That was one of the more powerful moments from the government leading the victim impact statements there. And the end quote from that specific translator was that she had remembered watching an interview with Do where he says that he doesn't speak with poor people, I think loosely quoting, and that it might be one of his greatest strengths that he turns rich people into poor people, which was one of the last quotes from that part of the opening salvo from the government. Then there was a lunch break, but I think in the back and forth, this is part of the thread that I tweeted out, where between the questions that Judge Engelmayer was asking both the government and the defense around this time, before we took a break, Judge Engelmayer basically stressed that he wasn't sure of any historical precedents that someone might be sent to another country after a sentencing has been handed down with the hopes that it would still be carried out or that it would still be honored, and asked the government, is there any reassurance that South Korea won't essentially just let Do Kwon walk after serving the 50% of the sentence that he's supposed to serve here in the U.S. as part of the plea deal. For example, if it is a 12-year sentence, that after 6 years, Do might go back to South Korea and just walk. And it didn't sound like there were that many assurances, and so he stressed, look, again, I'm not bound by, well, he didn't say it point blank that he's not bound by the plea agreement, but he did say that, he needs to take all of this into account, and also partially that was why he had stressed so much that he wanted to make sure both sides had enough time to read all of these letters. But then it was break, and we were setting ourselves up to hear from the defense and Do Kwon himself as we all returned from lunch. As we got back from lunch, David Patton, Do Kwon's attorney, stepped up to the podium, and I should note that this is a pretty high-power attorney, again, having defended Roman Storm in the Tornado Cash trial, one that has continued to come up, and one that noted that he began to know Do Kwon in the winter of 2024 when he was being held in Montenegro, where Do and him met in a room that was very cold. Do didn't have a jacket, basically stressed that he was not held in great conditions in Montenegro, and walked through all the points as to why Judge Engelmayer should be lenient on Do Kwon and that they should side with the 5-year sentence that the defense had argued for. And as we'll see, it did not go well, because Judge Engelmayer basically cut him off at multiple points during what was supposed to be, I think, a fairly routine summary on the defense's part, and then Do Kwon speaking. But basically, Judge Engelmayer cut David Patton off as soon as he mentioned that leaning into being overly judicious with the sentencing would be wrong and more akin to double jeopardy in sending Do back to South Korea with a more strict, longer sentence than just the 5 or 12 years. And Judge Engelmayer said, is it really like double jeopardy? And it felt like a pretty tense back and forth, because he had to basically walk back whether or not it would be full-on double jeopardy, or that Do Kwon would just have to be serving essentially some of the same sentences. Judge Engelmayer's point was that he shouldn't get any credit for being extradited to New York or to the U.S. over South Korea, because he also, Do Kwon, took these decisions as he wished, and that is something that he now has to deal with. And so it was a bit of a stressful back and forth on that point, and whether or not it should be brought in at all. And then we eventually heard from Do Kwon as Judge Engelmayer pushed back on that point and said, I will not give any points for the idea that Do should get a more lenient sentence just because he has to potentially face another sentencing in South Korea. Interestingly, I think it was also a bit of game theory in this part because Judge Engelmayer basically said, I, as the first sentencer in this game, can't assume anything about the second sentencer. I basically have to lean on them, taking into account what sentence I have handed down. And that's more on them than it is on him. And he also added, which I thought was kind of a funny back and forth, he said, I assume that Do will have the Korean version of David Patton over there in South Korea, but also made the record that you can have my word that I will support the application to transfer to South Korea 50% of the way through the sentence, as was originally agreed to in the plea agreement. So at least that piece was there. But again, kind of started to set up towards, okay, this isn't going to fall in between 5 or 12 years. I think the writing, if it wasn't already on the wall in the earlier part of today's sentencing, again, started to shift towards it looking more and more clear that he wasn't going to fall within the 5 to 12 year range in this part. And perhaps maybe to the other side of that, the government also tried to intervene in that back and forth, and Judge Engelmayer pretty sternly said that it is not your turn to the lead prosecutor there. Judge Engelmayer basically, I think at this point in the sentencing, was getting a little tired and or wanted to move things farther along, which is why we got to Do Kwon reading his own part of his defense, and he already submitted a letter that Judge Engelmayer himself called beautifully written. But at this point, you heard from Do, and basically said that there were a few things he wanted to communicate, and we can get into those. So after the government and the defense have already gone back and forth, Do was one of the last to speak, and he stood up and basically said that it was not easy to listen to all of the victim statements and hear about what the losses meant to them, and also in returning to Judge Engelmayer's first point, saying that he promises to read all the letters at the earliest opportunity. I think he also walked through that he admitted that he handled things differently in terms of perhaps how brash he responded to certain detractors of Terra throughout the years, and that also part of the reason why he wrote the letter he did and why he was making the statements at this point in time was his hope was, by telling the full story, that it will prevent other crypto founders from repeating the same mistakes. And then he continues to believe in the mission that Terra took up and the need for a decentralized currency, saying that it pains him greatly also to think about the fact that he has hurt the very people to whom he owes everything, that being the Terra community, and reflecting on it being 4 years since the Terra collapse and 3 since he's really seen his family, or his daughter for that matter, after the collapse and after the extradition, that a lot of the request for the sentencing is in order to be closer to his family. And then he closed with a direct message for those who were in the courtroom and that those he had worked with. He said, quote, "It's been the honor of my life to work with you." And there was a bit of mini applause, despite the earlier warning from Do's legal team not to react in the proceedings. Slight mini applause to that last nod as Do wrapped up. I should also say, unlike the Alex Mashinsky sentencing, where Mashinsky had broken down in tears at that moment in time, before also somewhat angrily after his sentencing, talking to the judge, that to me, when I was in the courtroom watching Mashinsky, that to me didn't really seem all that genuine. With this, as Do was reading it, he did also cry and was handed a tissue from his lawyer after he wrapped up and stood up. And it was, again, it's a weird experience to hear mini applause in the sentencing part for a defendant. At least hasn't been the case for any of the earlier crypto sentencings. But nonetheless, that's when there was, again, another mini break as Judge Engelmayer returned to his quarters to prepare his final ruling. Now, as is always the case with the sentencing, the judge always explains that they need to land on a sentence that is sufficient but not greater than necessary to deliver justice. And sentencing, now having seen all of these in person, they're not particularly fun because essentially you have a person walking through all of the reasons and thinking behind why they are deciding on exactly how long someone is going to be put behind bars, which sounds simple in principle, but in practice gets a little bit trickier, and in this case was a little bit long-winded in terms of it taking essentially, I think, an hour as Judge Engelmayer kind of walked through everything in detail. I think it was literally an hour, but he read extensively. I think he almost wanted everyone to know that he was not kidding when he said that he stayed up past midnight reading these letters, because he directly quoted on both sides, both from the defense and from Do Kwon's supporters, I think I want to say like more than 10 letters directly, if not indirectly, from the victims that we heard from in the courtroom, and also noted that it's an extremely complex and, quote, unusually challenging sentencing, because not only did it involve novel products like an algorithmic stablecoin, but also included a complex plea that he had rarely seen in his tenure on the bench, and also that it included a number of complicated pieces around the exceptional number of victims that were kind of all around the world. And so he walked through the factors off the bat that confirmed any consideration around would he or would he not fall into the 5 to 12 year framework or framing that we were prepared for given the plea agreement, and it became clear that he would not, because he basically kicked off saying, quote, even the 12-year sentence would be unreasonably lenient. And then he walked through why exactly he would fall above the 12-year agreed to sentencing expectation going into the sentencing, and said that, quote, this was a fraud on an epic generational scale. In explaining the number of factors that go into the mathematics, essentially he said 44 is around the highest number that when they add up all of the factors in a sentencing, essentially kind of the highest it can be, and that Doe's, when you add all that up, mostly because of the dollar losses here and the impacted victims, that it's essentially off the scale and literally the highest that it probably can be when it comes to the quantitative factors. But then he got into the qualitative factors, which again had a lot to do with the victims here, but more specifically the decision that Doe made around not telling everyone about Jump Crypto's involvement in repegging UST in 2021, saying, quote, to state the obvious, you chose to lie. When he was deciding what to tell people. He also brought up a number of tweets that if you're in the Terra community or if you're in crypto writ large, we've definitely seen before. Not only the Steady Lads deploying more capital tweet, which Judge Engelmayer brought up, by my count, 4 times. He also talked about the other messages that Doe had posted to detractors, saying that he doesn't debate the poor, and that specifically for Judge Engelmayer, for people in positions of power, that those moments are the ones that he finds revealing when it comes to character, saying, quote, you berated a well-founded skeptic. I find that revealing about who you are. He also noted that Doe did not submit financial records in this. He attacked the defense team for letting that happen, saying that he's covered a lot of white-collar fraud fraud trials in the past, and when you get to sentencing, that was extremely unusual, and that the filing that was submitted, that it was as damning a submission that he's seen in a fraud case, and kind of, again, highlighted the reasons as to why, mostly all the various lies that Doe had committed, and to Doe's credit, as he gets into later on, had taken responsibility for, saying that these are the things I lied about. Doe pleading guilty to those things is him trying to take responsibility for those things, him writing the letter and saying that this was all on me and that I can't blame Jump Crypto, is also where Judge Engelmayer starts to give him the other side of the sentencing, which is all the things that he's done right. And in naming those, again, he gave him credit for the letter that he had written saying that he takes on full responsibility, but knocked him for not giving a financial statement. So again, you can see where he's going back and forth here. But then he starts to wind things down after 50 minutes, saying that the nature of the risks that you take in a worldwide fraud mean that when you add all these things up, and when you have both the US prosecutors and Korean prosecutors going after you, that it cannot be the case that he lands at 12 years and leaves open the possibility that justice might not get served in South Korea, even though Doe's defense attorneys basically said that it's a guarantee. And from all the press reports leading up to all this, it does seem like South Korea is definitely going to pursue a pretty heavy sentence. But perhaps because of this U.S. sentence of 15 years, perhaps it starts to come into play. Interesting to think, though, that the plea deal does still set up 50% of the sentence that essentially the government will support that application to be transferred to South Korea after he serves 50% of the sentence, which in this case will be half of 15 plus the amount of time that has been added up from when Do was awaiting extradition and still in Montenegro. But interesting to think that potentially there could be an element of whether or not that changes, and perhaps he gets transferred sooner, because it is still up to the Justice Department whether or not that happens. And as we've seen right now with Trump's Justice Department, there are a number of either pardons or other decisions being made that have surprised people. And so I think there's an element of that, even though it was asked, Judge Engelmayer asked the defense if any political pieces of this might be considered here as well. Doe's attorney, David Patton, made it clear that they have not talked to anyone outside of the Southern District of New York, essentially saying that should not weigh into any of this because they do not expect any political intervention. So I thought that was pretty interesting as all of this was being added up and taken into account. To Judge Engelmayer's credit, though, he did say, look, it's anyone's guess what happens in South Korea after I make this final sentencing, but I am leaving it crystal clear in the record. It will be for the judge in Korea to decide what they want to do after this. He then also read through a number of the letters that came through that were testimonials to Doe's character, a lot of which came from people who he knew at Stanford in school, and basically speaking to the positives in Doe's life. But in the end, it was the case that he said he could not agree to what the government agreed to in their plea deal, saying, quote, "Try as I might, I simply cannot find a 12-year sentence reasonable. It would not be a just punishment." So I think it was interesting that he came down so strictly on Doe, again, above that, but then basically wrapped up with positive things to say to Do Kwon. Because at that point, the court ruling has already been read, Doe's standing, and you had Judge Engelmayer basically say that, look, this was as challenging sentence that I've had to deal with in quite some time. And then at the very, very end, basically the last thing that was said right before court was adjourned, Judge Engelmayer was speaking to Doe directly, which I think is also pretty rare. At least in the crypto ones, I should say, saying that you made an epically big mistake here and you're paying for it, but that I want to encourage you to not give up hope. Wishes him the very best. Doe says, "Thank you, Your Honor," and court is adjourned. But in general, and I guess the big takeaway is that 15 years is the final sentence, half of which will be served here in the U.S., and then Doe will be sent to South Korea. As of today's ruling, we'll have to see if any of that changes moving forward. But general takeaways were going into this that it wouldn't be that high. Of course, again, the defense asking for 5 years would have been far lower than what SPF got at 25, lower than what Mashinsky got. Do Kwon coming in at 15, we'll leave that question, I think, to our community and those watching to weigh in on whether or not that stacks up in proportion. Obviously, again, the losses here, you can make of them what you will, but pretty interesting, again, just kind of being in the courtroom and seeing the reaction from those in the courtroom after Doe was taken out of the courtroom. A pretty heavy sigh from him as he seemed surprised by the ruling, by the sentencing, I should say, and also silence and a stunned appearance on the part of David Patton and his attorneys on the legal team there. I don't think they were expecting this to go that way, which makes you wonder if it would have gone any differently if they had postponed it. But nonetheless, 15 years and half the sentence being served here before Doe now then has to also face a sentencing in South Korea, and the question of whether or not any of the time served here gets applied there, as the court was debating today. As the elevator doors closed, as Doe sighed and was taken away in handcuffs and the yellow jumpsuit, one of the supporters still there shouted, "Stay strong, Doe," and was also equally silent in the elevator banks as the doors closed. So, these sentencings are always different, and certainly was the case for SBF's and Alex Mashinsky's and other crypto sentencings. But this one having taken so long to get to since the collapse in 2022, it's a full circle moment, I think, for a lot of victims and a lot of people who were there for this collapse, just in the sheer size and the amount of people that either watched it or was impacted by it. So in general, I think I would echo what we heard from Judge Engelmayer, is that this one did feel different than some of those other ones that I have covered in the past. But you let us know in the comments, per usual, what you think of the ruling in the 15-year sentence and what is to come for Terra Founder Do Kwon. That'll do it. Per usual, you can like and subscribe to the channel and follow along for other updates around the world of crypto.